Like many of my generation, concerns for the environment may have come late in the day. For Neil, it was for myself and others, but it was nonetheless real and heartfelt. Neil cared about what would happen to the environment and what the future would hold, not only for his children, but for his grandchildren. So I am extremely grateful that our featured speaker tonight, Claudia Li, agreed to come and share with us her experience in fighting for the environment and the lessons that she has learned in the process. She is the founder of Shark Truth, the campaign to create a cultural framework for shark conservation that is now a program under her new organization, the Hua Foundation. Of Chinese heritage, Claudia has bridged two cultures, that of her country of birth, here in Canada, and that of her Chinese heritage. She speaks fluent Cantonese, and indeed her passion for the environment grew out of consuming shark fin soup at a family banquet. She has come a long way in a short time, and she holds a Bachelor of Business Administration from Simon Fraser University with an honors in sustainability. Explorer magazine chose her as a top 30 under 30 person of the year, and she sits on the board of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Please join me in welcoming Claudia Li for the 4th annual Neil Burton.
I'm very honored to be here today and bore you guys on a Wednesday night. And I thank each and every one of you for coming out to listen to my experience. I was sharing with a few folks earlier at dinner that I'm actually kind of nervous because we're going to be sharing, Kevin, my colleague over here, I'm sharing this story on our behalf. We're going to be sharing a very intimate part of our work that I've never really shared in public before. And a lot of it is the challenge we've had working on the shark fin issue and how we grew to Hua Foundation, which is the new organization we're working on right now. So kind of in the theme of Neil Burton and his work to try to promote harmony between Asia and Canada, that's what I hope I can share about today, is doing that work and promoting harmony. It's funny because a lot of people look at me as the shark fin soup lady or the shark fin girl, and I've had such weird experiences with that label from my family and my community that sometimes I actually go like this when I hear it. So you can call me, and I just want to let you know if I do that, it's just because of that. And I wanted to start off with maybe a story that one of my friends taught me a few weeks ago. And it's a story of Cook Ding. Does anyone know the story? Hands up. Okay. So I'm just going to read the story. Cook Ding was cutting up an ox for the ruler Wen Kuei. As he moved his hands, leaned forward with his shoulders, planted his foot, and pushed with his knee, the sound of flesh, I'm sorry if there are any vegans here, but it's just a story. The sound of flesh being cut and the knife slicing it were all in regular cadence as the dance of the mulberry grove and the blended notes of Jingshou music. "Ah, admirable that your skill should have become so consummate," exclaimed ruler Wen Kuei. Putting down his knife, the cook replied, "What your servant loves is the approach of the Tao, more advanced than any skill. When I first began to cut up the ox, I saw it in its entirety. After 3 years, I ceased to see it as a whole. Now I work with my spirit and not my eyes. My senses no longer function, and my spirit, it moves freely. Following the natural forms, the knife slides through large crevices and follow the big cavities as they are. Thus I avoid the sinews and big bones. A good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts. An ordinary cook changes his knife once a month because he cuts. An ordinary cook changes his knife once a month because he hacks. Now my knife has been used for 19 years. I think it's ironic because 19 is actually my favorite number. It has cut up several thousand oxen, and still its edge is as sharp as if it had just come from the whetstone. There are spaces between the joints while the blade of the knife has no thickness. When that which has no thickness is inserted in such spaces, there's ample space for the knife to move. This is why after 19 years, the edge of my knife is as sharp as it has just come from the whetstone. Nevertheless, whenever I come to a complicated part and see that it will be difficult, I proceed with care, I proceed with caution, keeping my eyes steady and moving my hands slowly. Then with only a slight movement of the knife, the part is readily separated and falls like a clump of earth to the ground. Standing up, I look all around, and with an air of satisfaction, I wipe the knife clean and put it away. The ruler replied, "Excellent! I've heard the words of cooked egg, and I've learned how to sustain life." So when I first heard this story a few weeks ago, it resonated with me a lot. And I guess it would help if you knew the background of why. So I want to share a little bit about my story, what we did at Chartreuse, and where we are now. This is a photo of me graduating, my mom and my dad. My mom's probably going to get upset because she's like, "I look like my eyes are really small. Why'd you pick that picture?" So I kind of always felt like I grew up in two worlds. One world where my parents had very traditional expectations of me, to become a doctor or lawyer. And when I told them I didn't want to do either thing, they said, "Oh, that's okay, as long as you marry one, then I'll be happy." So I haven't found one yet. If you know one, hook a sister up, that's all. And my parents worked a lot. They're from Hong Kong. I grew up in Canada. So my grandmother raised me as a kid. And while I never really thought systemically about environmental issues, some people call me environmentalist these days, I always kind of hated to waste, because my grandma, when she was really young, she was very poor, so she didn't have a lot. And in our family, it was very important to eat every grain of rice. And my grandma always told me to be very proud of that we're not wasteful in our house. So growing up in this household, in a very big traditional Chinese family, I was a neurotic recycler, like neurotic. I drove everyone nuts. But I, again, never thought systemically about environmental issues. And in the second world that I feel like I grew up in, I got really deep into environmental issues. So like was mentioned earlier, I was doing a business degree, and during the last semester, I was taking this course, and my friend wrote a paper on this documentary, Shark Water. How many people have seen it or heard of it? Hands up. How many people have no idea what shark finning is? Hands up. Okay, there's one person. I'll give you a private tutorial after. But I watched this documentary, and it talked about how important sharks are for our ocean ecosystem, and how this thing called shark fin soup was, killing off all the sharks that are really important for us. It also talked about how wasteful shark finning is. So I don't know if folks know, they didn't mention it in the documentary, but fins make up less than 5% of the average weight of a shark, of a body of a shark, but most of its financial value, so the rest is usually discarded. So when I saw this documentary, after my friend told me about it, I was like, wow, I've never felt that full cycle impact of one action I did and how it impacted the earth. And if I can speak English, and if I kind of care about environmental issues, and I don't even know about it, probably a lot of my family and friends, they just don't know about it. So I should probably do something about it. It was also right after the 2008 recession when I graduated, so I had to keep my hands busy while my mom was on my back. So I was like, oh, I'll just do a project. And I started off not really knowing what I was gonna do. But what I did know from the documentary are some of the things I mentioned. Sharks are really important for our ocean ecosystem. Shark finning is really bad, which is what's causing most of these sharks to be depleted. And the way the media was kind of talking about the shark finning issue was that shark fin soup is a Chinese delicacy, and it was a symbol of wealth and status. And so growing up, I always ate it, but I never thought of it like that. It was just kind of expected at wedding banquets, kind of like how you show up at Thanksgiving dinner and you expect a turkey, right? So although it started off representing wealth and status, I just kind of knew it as a product of, this is a thing I eat at wedding banquets. So with that kind of information, I was like, okay, I got to promote awareness about how shark finning is bad. And one of my friends is like, well, where's shark fin soup most popular? And I said, at wedding banquets. And he said, well, why don't we do a wedding contest that gets wedding couples to remove shark fin? And instead of just pointing fingers and blaming them, you reward them with a trip. So we did this wedding contest. That's how I came up with the idea. And someone asked me earlier, how did you come up with the idea for this NGO? And I actually said, it was working backwards. We started this wedding contest, and we're like, we need money to send wedding couples somewhere, so we should apply for a grant. And they're like, you can have money if you're a nonprofit society. I'm like, what's that? So, working backward, I registered for this nonprofit society. And through that wedding contest, where couples would submit a photo, and then the one with the most votes online is kind of vain, I know. The one with the most votes online would win a trip to swim with sharks. So it was kind of positive reinforcement. And the reason, looking back, why my friend came up with that really great idea that I implemented was because, they say there's only so many times in your life people really pay attention, and that's when you're born, when you die, and when you get married. So because this is one of those 3 moments, we're able to capitalize on the fact that this wedding couple, if they decide not to serve shark food, they tell their whole community. And their community can't be like, oh, you're getting married, but okay. They just kind of let it happen. So it becomes a moment for education. And every bowl that's not served, they have to explain why they're not serving it. So, people get why sharks are important. So this was in 2009, 4 years ago, when we started this contest. We ran it for 4 years. It's expanded to Hong Kong, and we've stopped about 80,000 bowls of shark fin from being eaten. And that also means 80,000 people at least have heard about it and know and have taken direct action, either by themselves or through the wedding couple. And so at this point, I still just graduated out of university, doing this little project with Kevin, who joined me as a volunteer, and I didn't think it was going to be anything more than just a wedding contest. I was like, I'm just going to run this wedding contest for the rest of my life, and then hopefully by then, all the sharks will be saved, and then no one will be drinking shark fin soup. Then we kind of came up with this, actually, I wanted to share some, just for fun, some photos from the wedding couples. This is Ty and Juliana. They won the first year. They had a 700-person wedding banquet in Vancouver. And they were so nice, they actually invited me to come. And Ty's dad is like a big community leader. He's a judge or something. So it was a big deal because they had cameras there, and they, at the beginning of the dinner, they explained why they weren't serving shark fin and told people to vote for them. That was great. They swam with 100 whale sharks in New Mexico. This is Joanna on the horse. She's also a wedding couple from the contest. I'll come back to her later. There's a story about her. This is Brenda. She's from Hong Kong, and she actually runs an eco-cosmetics business, and they donate some of their money to us as part of their kind of social strategy. I just like this one because I like Kill Bill. So there's nothing besides that to do with anything. Andrew and Jenny, they actually made that costume from scratch with their own hands. And we were such a dinky nonprofit that we didn't even have, we're a shark conservation group, and we didn't even have our own costume. So when they finished the photo shoot, they're like, do you want this? We're like, Rach? I said, yes. So they gave it to us. And Andrew's actually a donor to us too, which is a kind of a nice way of looking back and seeing how people that you were trying to change have now become your champions. This is Amy and Jackson, and they went on a deluxe cruise to the Galapagos for their wedding prize. And this is Judy and Jason. So they have a kind of funny story. They had a collective wedding of 1,000 people. So Judy's family's in Vancouver, Jason's family's Malaysia, they're in Malaysia. And so Judy, she had 300 people at her wedding with her family. And when she told her parents she didn't want to serve shark fin, they're like, yeah, sure, modern times, we can go with that. And then when Jason's parents in Malaysia found out, they're like, oh, they're trying to be better than us? So at the wedding, when they got to Malaysia, they didn't plan any of it. Jason's parents planned it. So when they got to the wedding, there's like all this Save the Shark, like huge banners, like this 800-person wedding, and there's all this memorabilia. And she was like, yeah, you go tell Judy's parents that we did that. Like, it became this little competition between the parents. It was great because that's the kind of amplification we need for this issue. So that's basically all I thought I was going to do, right, this wedding contest. And then we came up with this idea that, if we're getting wedding couples to not serve shark fin, why don't we also start talking to businesses, talking to restaurants that serve shark fin? And so we got these chefs to come up with shark fin soup alternatives. So the contest was called Sans Fin Soup. We're trying to be all cool with the French. And they had to come up with a recipe that had a story about Chinese culture. And then we had 300 guests come to this fancy hotel, and they tried the different soups and voted for their favorite one. So we just did it to get the chefs involved, but what ended up happening was that a community started coming together, talking around marine conservation beyond just shark finning. And then we started telling ourselves that if that could happen, maybe we could start approaching restaurants. So we approached one big traditional Chinese restaurant in Vancouver, and we convinced them to go Oceanwise. I don't know, do people know what Oceanwise is? So it's a Vancouver aquarium program that encourages restaurants and suppliers of seafood to source sustainably. And so we got the first traditional Chinese restaurant in Canada to go Oceanwise. And the way we did that was not by going in and saying that we want you to take shark fin off the menu, but by saying that we care about the oceans, and scientists predict by 2050 that our commercial fisheries are going to be extinct. So can you join us in figuring out how to make your menu a little bit more sustainable? And then we kind of slid in shark fin as like, and by the way, you also can't serve shark fin. So because in the beginning we were approaching restaurants saying, take shark fin off, and then they were just always defensive, right? Like, why are you attacking us? Why are you attacking this one thing that's been linked to Chinese culture? But when we started talking about marine conservation, they felt like they were part of something bigger. And so that's how we did that. That was a very big learning lesson for us because it changed the way we thought about how we talked about the shark fin issue. So we worked with consumers, we worked with restaurants, but I think most importantly, the thing that we didn't plan for, that we did do a lot of work on, is media. So you kind of have this really, I don't know if there's any communications people in here, but you have this very interesting storyline. You have this shark, which is a dangerous animal that's really misunderstood, and now they're being killed. And then you have the other character, which is by Chinese people who are eating shark fin soup. So for better or for worse, it kind of became this very sensationalized topic. And we became the authorities, even though most of the times I was like, oh my God, are you sure you want to come over? Because I'm still in my mom's basement. Mom, can Vancouver son come over? And so we became the authorities for talking about this issue. And in the beginning, when we started talking about it on the radio and in the newspapers, we went with a very conservation science approach. So it was, hi, my name's Claudia, I'm from Shark Truth. Shark finning is bad because up to 73 million sharks are being pushed to the elevated risk of extinction, which means that half of oceanic pelagic sharks are going to be wiped off this planet within the next 25 years. So, I'm listening to myself talking about it, I'm like, man, that's boring. And we kept talking about the science and these facts. And we very soon realized that it wasn't really sticking with people. There are definitely the science people out there, like Kev's a big science guy, so he's excited by those facts, but people who like eyes glaze over like that, like me, it didn't stick with them. They didn't feel it in their heart. And I could sense it when we were doing the radio shows. And so one day we were preparing for a press conference with this politician, and we're like, we need to come up with new talking points, because this whole time we've been saying the science stuff, no one's really listening. And so we started to ask ourselves, why do we do this work? Why do we even care? And we started to realize that there was a common story between me, Kev, and Al, who was running the wedding contest. And that commonality was the fact that all of our parents brought us over here from our respective places, Taiwan, Hong Kong, to give us a better quality of life because they didn't have it. And we just can't face the idea that all that hard work is going to go to the crapper if we don't have a planet to survive on, right? And so it really shifted again our mentality about how we talked about shark finning and shark conservation and why we did it, why we cared. And when we started talking on the radio with that story in mind, it started to stick to people, and they, instead of calling in, so the first radio interview I did, a Cantonese radio interview I did in 2009, basically all the callers called in and said, why are you doing this? You're making us look bad. You're trying to take away tradition, all this stuff. And then 4 years later, when we or 3 years later, after we changed the way we talked about it, the callers actually called in and said, we're really proud of you, which was a very big deal to us, because this whole time we've been doing this work, we felt very ostracized. On one hand, we have a community that feels like we're shaming them, our cultural elders or whatever you want to call that. And on the other hand, you have these conservation scientists and animal rights groups, and not to point fingers, but to simply just state the fact is that they don't know how to talk about the issue, right? So they came from it at a very scientific angle, and they're like, we don't understand why you're taking so long. Why does it take so long for people to understand this? Why can't they just stop eating shark fin soup? So when we change the messaging to that, and also to say that, like, look, there's already a lot of wedding couples who are not serving it, so it's not a big deal. It's just one thing. And there's so many other ways that you can showcase generosity, because the other thing that I learned about shark fin soup that I didn't learn from the documentary was that nobody ever orders shark fin soup on their own. It's always for a community, like, you know, as a celebration. So the very act of that is, you can say it's for face, you can say it's for wealth, but it's also to show that you're being generous. You want to give your guests the best that you have for coming to your special day. And we just told wedding couples, and on the radio shows we would say, there's other ways to be more generous, right? Instead of serving that, you could donate $1 per head to a charity, which shows that not only are you generous, but you care about society. So I would say that, you know, not to our credit at all, just ourselves, but with other organizations, that in the past 5 years, that conversation has fundamentally shifted from, I have no idea what you're talking about, stop taking away tradition, to I get it and I've done something about it. And the other side of the conversation that also shifted was, this still needs some work, but where people would say, like, oh, you know, why do Chinese people eat shark fin soup? It's kind of become less xenophobic, that discussion, I think. So this is kind of the juicy part, I guess. So I'm going to take a drink of water. So those were the first 2 years. Wedding contests, working with businesses, doing a lot of media and outreach. And it finally felt like we knew what we were doing. We're like, oh, okay, we got the messaging right. We're gonna talk about shark finning in this way. And we could start feeling people were connected. They could feel, you know, this idea of sacrificing for the next generation so that our community can survive, all communities can survive. And we're like, yes, we're finally getting somewhere, it's working. We got a call from Joanna, who's the woman on the horse. And she said, hey, Claudia, I actually was so inspired by the work that you guys do. I quit my job, and I'm working for a city council right now who's trying to put forward the first ban on shark fin soup in Canada, like for a big city. And I thought to myself, yeah, I'm not even gonna think about it. Like, I'm totally gonna sign up for this, right? Like, if I care about sharks, why would I not sign up to ban a product that I know is not good for the planet, young and naive. And so we collected tens of thousands of signatures. We sent it to Toronto. It was Toronto. And the city councilor put forth this ban. And what ended up happening was that it got a ton of media attention, a ton. And we, again, became the go-to spokespeople. And what happened was that journalists and interviewers sometimes would ask me, especially from English radio shows or newspapers, they would say, like, the first question off the bat, they'd be like, hi, Claudia, please introduce yourself, spell your name out, what organization you're with, what do you guys do? First question, why do Chinese people eat shark fin soup? And so just listening to that, like, I think everyone can kind of feel like, that doesn't feel right, right? And at that time, I would just kind of, I wasn't confident, so I didn't know how to unpack that. I didn't know how to say, actually, it's a dish that started in China from an emperor a long time ago, but it's actually really a Cantonese dish. If you go to Beijing 20 years ago, you've never heard of shark fin soup, right? It's very much a Cantonese Hong Kong thing. And second of all, it's a dish that's a class dish. Not everybody has access to it. Not all Chinese people eat it. You know, people who are poor don't drink shark fin soup, but that's kind of how it was talked about. And I think the other thing that was often missed in these kind of interviews was that shark fin soup became a label for Chinese people, and it didn't, or Chinese culture, and it didn't talk about all the other players that are involved in shark finning. And we're looking at big international organizations that are super bureaucratic, not moving. You're looking at national countries that are not being progressive on marine conservation. You're looking at the traders, you're looking at the black market. Like, there's so many players that are involved, but somehow we got stuck with this label because we're the consumers. And it painted this very monolithic image of what shark fin soup represents, which also meant it painted a monolithic image of what Chinese people represent. And I started to see why people didn't want to get involved with us, because if you were Chinese or ethnic Chinese or Hua, they didn't want to fall into that monolithic framework, that narrative, that that's all we're about. So I kind of felt really lost at this time because deep down inside during those interviews, I knew something was wrong. I knew that the way people asked me those questions and the way I responded, it really didn't do anybody justice. It just really fed into that monolithic image, which I actually kind of regret. I don't know if anyone's seen The Cove. It's about that guy who started the dolphin entertainment industry, and now he feels the weight of it because it spiraled into this huge thing that he lost control of. And in some ways, I don't get me wrong, I'm really proud of the work we've done, but in some ways, I also feel that weight of starting a conversation that we didn't end up having control of sometimes. And so I started to look, okay, you know, like we need to find our strength again, keeping in mind that like Kev and I were just volunteers and we're doing this off the side of our desk, but we were really passionate about it. And so while we were hearing all these things that we didn't agree with, I started to look to my elders and ask, you know, like, help us out, right? And they came back to me and it's like, yeah, you guys are being too pushy. You shouldn't push for shark fin bans. Don't you know that the history of Canada and how Chinese people got here, they used to ban us from this country. Just that language is offensive. So, you know, they kind of turned me away. And then I went to my family and my mom would introduce me as a shark fin lady. She's like, oh, my daughter, she doesn't like shark fin soup. And then immediately, wherever we went, if it was like an elder, Chinese elder, they would be like, they hated me off the bat. They'd be like, oh, so let me guess, you also hate cars and you're vegan and you only wear secondhand clothes. Like they started like throwing all these things at me. I'm just like, whoa, like where did that come from? They made a judgment call on me and I was like, okay, so I guess I'm not gonna get support from my family. And then I started to go to my peers, besides Kev and I and our 3 volunteers, my other friends, and saying like, wow, I'm having a really hard time. The way people are asking me questions about shark fin soup, it feels wrong, but I don't know how to articulate it yet. And they're like, well, why do you want to defend Chinese culture anyways? It's kind of going down the drain, it's irrelevant. Like, I'm not even kidding, like they would say that. And at first I'm like, what's wrong with you, right? Like, I mean, like everyone can identify what they are or are not. Just because you have yellow skin and black hair does not mean you have to identify as Chinese. But like I was like, your parents just moved here like 5 years ago, what do you mean you're not Chinese? And I started to kind of pay attention to my peers and why they acted like that. Not everyone acted like that, but some people did. And I started to hear conversations around like, you know, some aunties would say, oh, you can't read Chinese, you should be ashamed. Or you can't speak Chinese, you should be ashamed. And it was funny, I was laughing when John said that I'm fluent in Cantonese. I'm fluent relatively to everyone else that grew up here because all they're trying to do is assimilate. They just want to fit in with everyone else, so they just spoke English all the time. And so we have, you know, these young people that are trying to kind of reconnect with their culture and maybe stand up for it, but they couldn't because they always felt ashamed for never being good enough. And I'm not saying all elders are like this, but that's my experience in my family too, was that if you couldn't speak Chinese, you should be ashamed. So what do you do when you're a young kid, right? Like you're trying to get your parents to listen to you practice your crappy Cantonese, and they're like, it's not good enough, then you never want to touch it. You're like, okay, fine, I'm not Chinese. And so nobody really wanted to help us defend this monolithic image, and I started to become a little apathetic myself because I started to buy into that hype. And buy into the hype that that's the way we are, and there's nothing you can do about it. And you know, everything we're doing is too extreme, and that we're betraying our people, we're betraying our culture. And so, you know, I stand up here saying those words, but at that time I had a really, really hard struggle trying to figure out, you know, what that meant for me, because that's part of my identity, that's who I am. And that's what a lot of these young people were going through. you know, you're talking to these young Chinese people and they're like, oh, I don't know anything about shark fin soup. They don't want to get involved in that conversation because it became so polarized. The way our community, the way a lot of the businesses and general community reacted was like, why didn't you give us a chance to understand the issue before you slapped a ban on our face? And I told, in the beginning, I didn't get that, I didn't listen to them. But then I started to see. And the other thing I realized was that, you know, I was living a very environmentalist lifestyle because I started getting really deep into, you know, different communities that were holding dialogues and stuff. So I was riding my bike, I was trying to be vegetarian, I was bringing home these organic lentil loaves, and my mom was like, what the hell is this I'm eating? You know, like, that did happen to me, and that all those things are great, and if you do them, please keep doing them. But at that time, that's all I saw was that idealist, what I call like green idealism or paralysis, is that perfection of like being the person that lives on the land and grows your own food. And I was trying to strive for that, and anybody who wasn't involved felt like they couldn't get involved because that's what they had to be. And if they did it, they don't deserve to be an environmentalist or whatever. And so I started to forget about my culture, about my roots and where I came from. And when people would say like, yeah, Chinese people eat shark fin soup, I would start to say, yeah, it's true, we do all this bad stuff. You know, I started to get really jaded. And the funny thing about nonprofit work and doing social change is that, whatever you want to call this, environmentalism, is that there's many formulas. So unlike operating a business, you make a product, you kick butt at it, it makes you money, and you keep making more. But in the system that we live in, it doesn't support social change or good work. You have to figure out, one, the formula of how you're actually going to make social change. How are you actually going to stop shark fin? And in the beginning, I was like, I'm just going to do this wedding contest, and you know, by the time I'm 50, all the weddings won't have shark fin, and then the sharks will be saved. But then I started to realize like it's way more complex than I thought it was. So, you know, you have to know that formula. The second formula you have to know, nobody tells you when you get into nonprofit, is that you have to figure out how to fund it. So if you want to make a livelihood out of it, you have to figure out how to fundraise, which is totally different. I don't care what anyone says, it's a different ballgame. And the third thing is that if you want that program or whatever you're doing to last, you have to think like a business person. How are you going to operate? Where are you going to operate? Who are you going to hire? So at this point, I'm jaded, I'm confused, I want to give up, and I started, because of all those pressures, I started to lose hair, like I got alopecia. This was last year in August. And it was funny because I was sitting down at my computer, like putting my hair in a ponytail, and Kev came over to look at some paperwork, and he was like, what's that? And I'm like, what's what? He put his finger on the bald spot, and I was like, oh! Not to offend anyone who's, you know, whatever, but, you know, I was 25, right? Like, you know, I was still looking for the perfect Chinese doctor, lawyer, husband, dude. I'm like, I'm gonna do that with this bald spot. So I was like, okay, you know, maybe I should just take a break, and, you know, relax a little. So I did. So last year I went to Asia, and I went backpacking for 4 months. So my roots with China is very distant. My parents are from Hong Kong, but I grew up in the West Coast my whole life. I'm a city girl. But I actually found out that my grandma grew up in she's Hakka, which is an ethnic clan in China, and they come up from the north, and they migrated to the south, which is where my grandma ended up being in Guangzhou, which is the province, capital of the province of Guangdong. And one thing that my grandma used to always say is like, don't you know Hakka people we're travelers, we're nomads. So my grandma has an amazing green thumb, which my mom inherited, which I didn't. Don't give me a plant, I'll kill it. And that's what she's told me. That was the history of Hakka people, was that they were always persecuted wherever they went. So they always knew how to grow food and like build a small community, get kicked out, next one. And so when I went on this trip, I went with my daima and my yima, which is my first aunt and my second aunt on my mother's side, my maternal family. And this photo is actually a photo of the hotel that she used to squat at out in Guangzhou. That's still there. I took that photo. I'm trying not to get emotional. So she was really poor, and her parents died when she was very young, I think around when she was 12 or 13. And so she had a little brother, and just to make ends meet, she would squat outside this hotel and collect all the cigarette butts and squeeze out all the tobacco so that she could resell the cigarettes. And when I was there, I started to learn about these stories. And my daima also told me how she ended up, my grandma, my Paul, ended up in a fishing village in Hong Kong after running away a bunch with her little brother. And when she had 5 kids, including my mom, who was the third, they all had jobs. So my daima told me how her job was to hustle on the streets, make money, and every morning in the fishing village she had to beat all the other fishermen and get out into the waters and like dig as much clams and stuff before they got there so that they would have food to eat. My yima, my second aunt, her job was to take care of the family. And then my mom and my fourth aunt, their job was to take care of the youngest brother, the 5th sibling, and also they got to go to school. And so when they told me these stories, and when I got a chance to kind of remove myself from the bubble that I built around me doing the shark fin stuff at Shark Truth, I started to finally hear for the first time why my community was reacting the way they did, and why my elders were reacting the way they did, and why they said shark fin bans were discriminatory. And it's because of those stories that my mom was like, you know, she never really said it to me, but what she implied when I heard these stories and I retold them to her was that, girl, we worked so damn hard for you so that you could have a better quality of life, and here you are talking about Chinese culture and just linking it to shark fin soup and how it's destroying the world. You know, you're making us lose space. Like, how could you do that to us? And that was a knee-jerk reaction that you would hear in the media when shark fin bans were being talked about. And then I also realized that, you know, this idea of this traditional way of talking about environmentalism or conservation is very much linked to the back to the land. So I have this friend, he's a food security researcher. He's mixed, he's half Chinese and half white, his mom's Chinese. And he told me these 2 stories that has stuck with me a long time. And the first one is about how when he always tells his mom, like, you know, I'm an environmentalist, I'm trying to do food security, you know, we need to go back to the land, we need to grow on the land, we need to protect the land. His Chinese mom was like, are you kidding me? We just came from the land, you want to go back already? Like, or right now, like, we just came, like, we just got settled, like, are you a, you know, whatever, a house to live in, and all these things. And so that kind of, it's a joke, but at the same time, it shows the contrast between what's happening with the traditional environmental movement. And I've worked with big, you know, Western environmental groups, and not to point fingers or criticize, but the way it was birthed was based off of opposition. So you always had an enemy, you always had a target, you always had someone you want to make be submissive to you. But nowadays, if you're trying to get different people on board with different issues, it's not necessarily that approach will work. So I started to realize while I was away that, you know, that idea of going back to the land is not going to work. Like, of saying that we just need to protect these sharks and look at it from a distance and watch nature as it grows without us, because my grandmother, you know, she worked on a farm, she took care of chickens and stuff, so her idea of nature from where she grew up was very much based in survival. They don't look at nature as a thing to appreciate and paint, even though that would be great if she did. She looks at it as like, how am I going to put food on the table for my kids? And so I started to understand that aspect of what we're doing a little more. And the other story that my friend who works in food security told me was that every time they go to eat Chinese food, they throw their ethics out the window. And I'm like, why? That's so unfair. That's like this kind of defeatist, like, it'll never change, so why should we care? Why should we give a crap? And when I was traveling in China, I actually visited an organic farm started by someone in Beijing, and she worked with local farmers to grow organic, and she sold the produce to the city. And so, you know, I was seeing people in my ancestral land, so to speak, doing things differently in a way that celebrated people and the culture. But we weren't doing that here at home. So when I came back, I was like, I have no idea what to do with all this. I think I'm just gonna stay in my little sad place and try to let it go. And so when I came home after the trip, I was like, wow, I realized all these things, what am I gonna do about it? We still had things to do for Shark Truth. We had deliverables to finish. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna re-inspire myself. I'm gonna think about my family. I'm gonna re-watch this documentary on shark called Shark Water. And don't get me wrong, it's a great documentary. I know Rob, he's a great guy, he's brilliant. But when I watched this documentary again to try to re-inspire myself, I was actually pretty pissed off. Because I started to see the issue through those lenses when the way they framed it, the shark finning issue, was kind of pointing fingers instead of trying to create understanding with each other. And so it's not to say that any of the things they said is untrue, but they also left out another part of the conversation. So I kind of sat down with Kevin. I was like, look, well, I didn't really have to sit down with him. He was just like, Claude, what's wrong? Like, you're acting different, you're acting weird. And I kind of shared with him some of these thoughts, and he's like, yeah, I know. That's basically what we've been fighting. We've been trying to create this voice that says, let's celebrate culture, but let's change it a little bit to make it better for the planet. And our voice got drowned out when we started working on shark fin bans, which isn't what we wanted. And we started to realize that, like, you know, if you just look at the numbers purely, you know, ethnic Chinese is the biggest population in Canada, minority-wise. And same within Metro Vancouver. We make up 21% of the population. And it's diverse, and it's, you know, sometimes it's fragmented, and it's not to, again, try to paint that monolithic picture, but it's a big community. And if we keep working on this shark fin issue the way we have been, we're going to piss off a lot of people that could be champions, that could take part in all these other things. When I was in China, I went to villages where they had no freaking water. They didn't have water, they didn't have electricity. You know, people were living in a way that I could never imagine, because I pretty much grew up middle upper class, right? The weather was disgusting, because I was taking long trains, and you would see all this pollution. It was like cheese, you could cut through it. And you look at the water, and it's polluted, and I'm like, wow, look at this beautiful place, and look how much we're messing it up. And I started to connect that with our community back home, and saying, like, there's so many issues that we need them to care about. We can't just make them angry on this one thing that we might not even win on. And so that was kind of, oh wait, no, yeah. So that's a shark, and all the other issues. So I went back to this, I would like to go back to the story about Cookding. And so remember kind of the way the author describes it, he's kind of moving with this flow, and he's very strategic. And if we were to use a different analogy, we could say wood instead of an animal. That I thought I was cutting with the grain, but I was only cutting with the grain relative to everyone else who was definitely hacking. So in this story, the reason why it resonated with me so much was because when my friend told it to me, I was actually kind of angry, because I said, he's totally dissing me. Those cooks that have dull knives have been hacking their way through the problem, trying to force my way of thinking down someone else's throat without really understanding where they're coming from, without understanding the wood, without understanding the grain, where the knots are, where to avoid it. And I started to ask myself, is this how I wanted to keep doing the work? Because my spirit was getting killed. I was becoming very cynical, and I started to believe that it can be better. So after coming to those realizations, I said, okay, come on, Kev, like, we gotta be a little bit strong and think differently. And that's when we decided to continue doing chartreuse work, but just focus on the wedding contest, and make it a program of this new organization called Hua Foundation. So Hua is a play on words in Mandarin that means ethnic Chinese, it means culture, and it means change. So Huaren, Bien Hua, and Wen Hua. And so our idea is that we change from just being issue-based to being community-based. How do we build a community that transcends issues environmentally, so that we're not always doing these blips of work? Like, okay, shark fin win, okay, now I'm gonna start over again. Food security win, now I'm gonna start over again. How do we build a community in a way that they can act on many issues along the way and continue to grow? And we went back to that question of why we're doing this, and I'm dead serious when it is really for that legacy that we want to leave on this planet, because it doesn't matter if my kids are doctors or lawyers if they don't even have clean water to drink, right? There's so many issues that we want them to get excited about. And our office is actually close to Chinatown, and when we came up with this idea, we're like, okay, we got to think of a new project that it excites us again and brings our spirits back to life. And we were walking through all these Chinese grocery stores, these green grocers, and we started to realize there's a lot of local produce that gets actually grown in BC, Chinese produce. But I didn't know until I walked down there. And so we said for ourselves, you know, why does the conclusion of that story have to be that I bring home an organic lentil loaf and my mom hates me for it? Why can't it be that I bring home some healthy Chinese food and my mom and I celebrate together? But those solutions don't exist right now. So we decided to launch a new program under Hua Foundation called the Choi Project. And some of the things we're doing for that. The other thing I learned about building community or doing this kind of different work is that you kind of just throw things out there and just see what sticks, and not bet that everyone will. So some of the things we're throwing out there include a seasonal Choi produce guide. So, you know, when's bok choy in season? When is it grown locally? So young people can reconnect to that food again. We're experimenting with a green grocer in Chinatown in Vancouver, and we're trying to see if labeling will make a difference. So having things in English, traditional, and simplified Chinese with the Cantonese phonetics and the Mandarin phonetics, so that young people can reconnect to their food again, right? It's that same idea to try to gap that intergenerational divide, that we don't have the language to reconnect. And the last thing I will talk about, or the last two things I'll talk about, is we're also doing cooking workshops. They're called Kitchen Table Series, Jima, so grandma, where we get our elders to come in, teach us traditional foods, and we hope to showcase a diversity of stuff, you know, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Beijing, wherever. And our job as the young people is to figure out how to make it sustainable. So our first workshop we did was with wontons. One of our friends' grandmother came and taught us, and we made it with organic pork, which ended up being the same price as regular pork that you buy from TNT, which sucks. So that's kind of another way that we're trying to bridge that intergenerational divide through food. And then the last thing, which is the kind of biggest piece of this program, is the Choi Market Box. So we're trying to find growers of Chinese produce locally and seeing if there are any pesticide-free ones, and if not, how can we work with the community to figure out what their needs are to bring more healthy food to our families. Because it's kind of ironic, because when I started Chartreuse, I think it was a few months before I started Chartreuse, my grandmother passed away, and that's when that idea of not wasting was really up in front of my face. And that event really motivated me to work on Chartreuse, this idea of not wasting. And then when I came back from the trip, my second aunt, my Yima, who was a caretaker for a family, she passed away, and it was from cancer. And what she was known for in the family out of the 5 siblings was that she loved to eat. And so another reason why we were doing this project, or thought of this project, was because that story really stuck with me of, like, you know, I can't say for sure what made my aunt sick, but I know that the things we eat, we don't know what's exactly in them. So why don't we deserve the food that makes our bellies happy as well as our hearts, right? It can be both. So that's kind of what we do with that program. And Chartreuse is our main focus with Chartreuse is trying to open source a wedding contest so any ally organization in the world can use it. We've already tested it in Hong Kong, and basically we give them all the logos and all that stuff, and they can use it for free. They just got to give us credit. And I think at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is just build understanding and trust. Like, we only use the word education when we have to write a grant, but honestly, that's what we're trying to do, is just, you know, in the spirit of Neil Burton and his work and his passion for trying to bridge those divides, is that same thing. Because if you look at Vancouver, if you look at Victoria, if you look at Canada, it's only going to get more and more diverse. And if we don't work in a way that builds a common understanding, we're all going to be kind of screwed, right? And so our hope with Hua Foundation and through our work through these issues is that we can talk about it in a way that gives people the energy and the excitement to act on multiple things. And we won't be cutting wood against the grain or coming up with the knots. And it sounds like we have it all figured out, but we don't. This is just, we just launched the new organization in November, and we're really in experiment mode still. One of the things that we were talking about when we were having food a bit earlier as well is this idea that when we look at how we talk about environmental issues, and there's some issues where you really do have to yell, it's a big corporation that won't listen to you, but when it's someone in the family, when it's someone really, and you know, I've been talking about Chinese stuff this whole time, but this is really for anyone that's ever felt like they've had to choose or been ashamed of any part of them, because what I think we want is for people to embrace all parts of who they are and be proud of wherever they come from and whatever they're passionate about, and truly show that they can actually make a difference, no matter how big or small, but if they try.